Okay, so here we are on the CES letter. Again, we're going to call this part 6. So, the black ban is what Jeremy's calling this. Finished up the last one, had to do with the polygamy and so forth. Not just the polygamy, really, in that issue. It was the prophets, questionability of their changing doctrine, since Brigham Young said it was necessary to have multiple wives to become a god, on top of the Adam God doctrine and the blood atonement doctrine. So, yesterday's truths, or today's false doctrine. So maybe I'll call this 5B then, because this whole section isn't really about the black ban only. It's about the fact that we have changing doctrines, and these prophets, are not speaking eternal truth, because truth just keeps changing here, as we see. And that's really the focus of this particular section. So we call the first one, I'll call it 5A, and this one then 5B. And we're getting into the race and priesthood and so forth issue. So Jeremy's take on this is a bit different than mine, so I'll go ahead and mention where we've got differences. But so according to Jeremy, it says, as you know, for close to 130 years, blacks, meaning African Negroes, were not only banned from holding the priesthood, but black individuals and families were blocked from the saving ordinances of the temple. Every single prophet, from Brigham Young all the way to Harold B. Lee, kept this ban in place, as Jeremy calls it. And I said African Negroes until, he says, he thinks this started with Brigham Young, which I disagree on, although Brigham Young made it very clear, and then went to Spencer Kimball. Now, black Fijians, I think it was in 1958 or something like that, they started receiving the priesthood, so we don't see a lot of publicity about that, but that's thought-provoking, isn't it? Okay, Jeremy says saving ordinances of the temple. No, that's not true. Sorry, Jeremy. Saving ordinances are baptism and confirmation, the gift of the Holy Ghost. The temple ordinances that people receive, the endowment and sealing, those are pertaining to exaltation, not to salvation, not to entering the celestial kingdom, but to obtaining the highest degree and godhood. So there's a difference there. I'll differ with you on that one. Prophets, seers, and revelators in 2013 have now disavowed these teachings as theories, false theories, and racist doctrines. Essentially, they said we disavow the theory that a skin of blackness is a sign of divine disfavor or a curse, and they further state that we condemn all racist teachings past and present. So they're calling these teachings racist. However, the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses and the Book of Abraham say that it's God doing it, and specifically using the word curse as pertaining to the priesthood in Abraham chapter 1, and as pertaining to a skin of blackness in Alma chapter 3 and 2nd Nephi chapter 5 in the Book of Mormon, talking about the Lamanites. That has nothing to do with priesthood, but it says they were cursed and there was a mark put upon them, just like there was a mark put upon Cain. And we see that in the Book of Moses, Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible. He states that the seed of Cain were black and had no place among them, meaning the other children of Adam. At that point, the really good ones were with Enoch and the Lord in Zion. Everybody else was hanging out together as a mixture of the seed of Adam, except for the seed of Cain, and they were black and had no place among them. Except for the other Canaanites who got turned black, so they couldn't have already been black since they got turned black when they murdered the people of Shem, and there came a blackness upon them that they were despised of all men. And they lived in a place, sounds like the Sahara Desert, where the barrenness went forth and expanded. Nobody else lived there but these black people, and they were called the Canaanites. And of course, the hyperlinks went between that and Abraham chapter 1, making sure we knew that the Canaanites who could not hold the priesthood, that were cursed according to the priesthood, the descendants of Egyptus, the wife of Ham, could not receive this priesthood, and that they were the same people called Canaanites earlier, apparently. It links there. Make sure we understood that these were people that were black, and it also said that they were the people that inhabited Egypt. So all the people in Egypt could not receive the priesthood, which gets a little bit difficult for Joseph Smith, like I mentioned earlier, since Joseph, the patriarch, was sold into Egypt and he married an Egyptian girl. So he had mixed blood children, Ephraim and Manasseh. So nobody with the patriarchal blessing of Ephraim or Manasseh should be able to receive the priesthood, according to Joseph Smith's teachings in Abraham chapter 1, which is probably, in my mind, why he never got around to translating the book of Joseph, which was there with the book of Abraham, supposedly, the papyrus, which said that these were written by the hand of Abraham, and that the writings of Joseph were there too. Of course, the church has also gone ahead and denied in another Gospel Topics essay that it actually was the writings of Abraham, since it's been proven to be Egyptian funerary text written about 2,000 years later. And they just said Joseph was getting inspired. So he wasted $2,400 of somebody else's money and could have bought 300 acres of land in Kirtland at the time. So what? They didn't need money. They just made the Kirtland wannabe bank to, expand on their land speculation things for nothing. Anyway, not the time for that. All right, so Jeremy says, Heavenly Father shouldn't have been so damn racist here. That's essentially what he's saying. He says, Joseph Smith allowed the priesthood to go to Elijah Abel and Walker Lewis. Well, I've looked into that, and apparently, at the University of Utah, professor there has an extensive research, and there is zero evidence that Elijah Abel ever received the priesthood. So, you might have assumed that, and he's been referred to as becoming a 70, which has nothing to do with the priesthood in the New Testament, by the way, and nothing to do with that until, Joseph Smith decided to invent the priesthood and backdate it by several years. The event, which nobody seemed to know about, William McClellan, who was an apostle, never knew he had the priesthood. Never knew that he said that, Melchizedek priesthood. I don't know anything about it. Nobody conferred that on me. Same thing with David Whitmer. They never heard of such a thing. So Joseph and Oliver came up with this baloney and then backdated this whole restoration of the priesthood. But that's another issue here too. So this Walker Lewis, I looked him up. His first name is Kwaku. How ironic is that? Kwaku, like Kwaku and the three Mormons that are really two. The boys preaching the same kind of stuff here, and telling us this is just all this racist stuff. All these racist Americans were mistreating the blacks, and everybody was like a slaveholder. When really 1.5% of whites owned slaves at the height of black slavery, and there were actually hundreds of thousands of white slaves, more than there were black slaves in the 1600s. Supposedly over half the people that came into the colonies came as slaves, white people. We know that before the British started shipping their prisoners over to Australia in 1776, when the war broke out, they'd already sent 50,000 to Georgia as slaves. Plus, probably they say you'd estimate, and sometimes in London they did estimates of 10,000 per year. In addition to that, they were just being sold or kidnapped or whatever. So they hide that in American history to create a narrative that is more in line with the whole political correct doctrine. And did I mention 28%? Up to 28%, according to some studies, of the blacks who became free wound up as slave owners of their own people. Yeah, well, that's not something that politically correct people want to talk about, but facts are problems, just like they are for Mormon apologists. So we got these guys that he says are priesthood holders, but every time Elijah Abel got a chance to say that he actually did have the priesthood, even though he couldn't ever show any certificate for it, he said Joseph Smith said he deserved it. Never in his talks, even as a 70, did he say that he actually had the priesthood. So yeah, extensive research has been done, and there's zero proof that he ever had the priesthood. And when Joseph Smith declared in Abraham chapter 1 that Canaanites, who he readily identified as blacks, Negroes, could not hold the priesthood, that certainly makes it doctrinal, and that makes it scriptural, and everybody ignores that. Church ignores it in their essays. Kwaku and Ian ignore it on Three Mormons. And Jeremy isn't mentioning it here. No, he's got it all as Brigham Young too, just like they do. So, yeah, open the scriptures, guys. Abraham chapter 1, Moses chapter 7, Canaanites are black. God made them that way because, you know, he did it after they murdered the people of Shem. And if anybody's racist, it's God. According to this. And then again, of course, the whole Abraham thing got published right when Joseph Smith became a Freemason and put that in the temple and part of the endowment, used Freemasonry. He joined the Nauvoo Lodge, which was apparently organized by the York Rite. We have the York Rite and the Scottish Rite as the white rites, and the Prince Hall Masons as the black Negro Freemasons in America from the 1700s. Freemasonry was completely segregated, and I think it pretty much is now. I've seen plenty of pictures of Prince Hall Freemasons, and I don't see any white boys. And I don't see anybody screaming about the segregation within Masonry, talking about white supremacy or anything, no. And the Negroes, I don't see them talking about black supremacy having to do with it. It's just the blacks are... They've got their thing, and the whites have got their thing, and as far as I know, you're not allowed to mix it. Maybe in the Eastern Star, and they have women in that too. That's, you know, pretty much Masonically related, but I don't know all the intricacies of it. So, Jeremy says here that he thinks God should have been leading civil rights. It has nothing to do with civil rights. Masonry, it's not a right to have a white guy in a black rite. It's not a right... using the word right in multiple ways. It's not the blacks' right to be part of the whites. It's not the whites' right to be part of the blacks. Nobody screws with it with Freemasonry. Why are they doing it with the church? It's not a civil right. It's a religion. And Masonry is essentially a religion as declared by Albert Pike, one of their biggest leaders ever. So I don't really agree with that either. But the fact is that the blacks probably needed to be excluded from the priesthood in the temple because they couldn't be they were making Masons out of white boys there quickly before they received their endowments so that they could receive Masonic tokens, science tokens, and key words without violating the oath. Didn't want Joseph to be killed for doing that, did they? So anyway, yeah, he brought Freemasonry in, and all these things happened exactly at that time. But it's just a coincidence, right? So Jeremy seems to think that it was just Brigham Young being a racist guy. Not saying he wasn't racist, but I don't think all the Americans were, like that theme that Kwaku tries to push. Oh, and this guy here, you know, Kwaku the First, Kwaku Walker Lewis that Jeremy's talking about, yeah, he was a Prince Hall Freemason, just a side note there. So, yeah, anyway. So, later on, blacks get the priesthood, black Negroes. Like I said, black Fijians got it much earlier. But the black Negroes got it in 1978. And Jeremy's saying, well, maybe it's pressure, you know, Jimmy Carter, we got that rumor he was threatening them and so forth. He's threatening multiple schools, actually, that were segregated in some way. And Stanford wouldn't, you know, play sports with BYU. But, you know, the real thing is, if we look at and I've said this in other videos, the thing that would have really hammered the church was the fact that apparently they didn't do a very good demographic study before they decided that the first temple in all of South America would be in São Paulo, Brazil, where there is an extremely high amount of mixed race. And one drop of the Canaanite blood says you're out, baby. So when we looked at that WikiLeaks thing and I put that video out on, where Bruce McConkie said that they had been discussing a couple of things regarding Brazil, the São Paulo temple with regard to race, and Brazilian patriarchal blessings. Can you imagine a patriarchal blessing that says you're going to get married in the temple and then get the priesthood and all this because you're pretty white looking, and they figure out, oh, great-grandma married a Negro. You've got some of that blood of Cain, and you cannot have the priesthood, you cannot go to the temple, and that just meant that your patriarchal blessing was fraudulent. Busted. Busted. False prophet patriarchs. Soothsayers in disguise. So that was a major concern anyway. The São Paulo temple would have been a complete and total disaster, so 3 months before it opened, 4 months, it was opened in October, dedicated. They wouldn't have had any people, wouldn't have enough people probably to make it work, to be temple workers, let alone the whole country. We would have been ticking off a whole lot of people. They might have been paying building fund and tithing and all that stuff, and they couldn't attend the temple. And then people from all over South America and Central America, possibly, people that weren't going up to, say, Mexico City, wouldn't be able to have their temple ordinances performed. I mean, it would have been a total disaster. So Spencer, he got him up a revelation, kind of like old Joseph Smith used to do, and it worked out just right. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Or you can just figure it's another coincidence. But there sure are a lot of coincidences in this church. And what we find here, so the main theme of this again was that why was God changing his mind? So did he change his mind because of possible problem with exemption from income tax for the 501c3 corporate empire of the church? Or because they were really upset about Stanford not playing football at BYU, or because they were going to have a public relations disaster, a membership disaster, all kinds of disaster in Brazil because some idiot said, let's put it in Sao Paulo instead of, Cartagena, Colombia, or Lima, Peru, or Buenos Aires, Argentina, or Santiago, Chile, or, they said put it in Sao Paulo, where you had all kinds of white Negroes, as they called them. 4-generation program for family research, family history was instigated by President Kimball right about, not too far from that time. Was it before then? They were looking back 4 generations to check on pictures to make sure he didn't look like anybody was Negroid when people were joining the church in Brazil, is what I have read, seen, heard, that sort of thing. So, major concerns. Was God just changing his mind? No, God was always telling us that that's how we tell how people were in the premortal existence. That's what we're teaching right now in the patriarchal blessings. Get a blessing that says you're from Ephraim because you're a choice spirit and you were valiant in the premortal existence. Everything's gradation. It's not everybody's perfect, everybody's horrible. Everybody's different levels of things in all sorts of things, and it would totally make sense in this too. So Mark E. Peterson explained what had been taught before him, and from Orson Pratt, saying that God justified the way people were born into this world by how they were in the premortal existence, and the blacks were just, they were just about as bad as you could get without joining the bad guys and getting shipped down for the highway to hell for eternity. So that's what they were teaching. And what was her name? Johanna Southcott or something, who her disciples were in England, and a bunch of them got baptized by people like Parley P. Pratt and Orson Pratt, and came over, and that extended Curse of Cain doctrine came over with them apparently and was adopted, saying that Egyptus actually was pregnant with a black child from a completely black person before she got on the boat with her white husband Ham. So we had some people that could look completely undiluted black, as well as people after that might have been mulatto with her white husband. Maybe that gives us a little way to make anthropology sort of work for a while, until they found other DNA evidence of everything else in the Book of Mormon and LDS theology being a hoax. So there we go. Doctrines change. We adapt them for financial gain, for success for the corporate empire, and they have zip, zero, and zilch to do with what this God of Israel says, because Brigham said this is the law of God, this is the way it's going to be. The blacks aren't going to get the priesthood till, millennium or after the millennium or something, when everybody else is, Abel's seed, are blessed. Maybe he gets to live again in the resurrection and in the millennium and raise children and some weird things. Who knows? We've already heard about Brigham's bizarre doctrines, but the more you think about this stuff, the weirder it just gets. If you think and extrapolate along the theological lines that we have in this or other religions, it always gets pretty weird when you get into eternity and see how the plan, turns out in the end. Whether you're creating worlds and populating them and having billions of planets or whatever you're doing, we've got conflicting doctrines about that. God, he evolved from being a man on an earth, or he created all things before. How could he create all things before he was even a God? God and his father and his father and his father. Well, that goes against the whole doctrine in Ephesians and Hebrews that said God created all things through Jesus Christ. So we don't talk much about it. No wonder they keep it short and sweet with the plan of salvation and seminary, like Boyd K. Packer said to do, and then just keep going ahead and reiterating a little bit, or reinforcing it as the year goes along. But when I didn't teach seminary, when I did the presentation on the seminary thing, when we looked at what was in the teacher's manual, they had a very incomplete plan of salvation diagram. Didn't have the three kingdoms, and it didn't have what was going on in the spirit world, the heaven and hell, or paradise and prison, or whatever you wanted to call it, divisions there. Didn't want the students to think too much about it, wanted to keep it brief. The more you think about it, the more problems there are with it. Especially like, everybody that died without the Gospels in the same hell that that stinking Mao Zedong's in, and Fidel Castro or whoever, does that really make sense? And they just got to wait for the missionaries a couple thousand years, rotting, burning in hell, in a lake of fire and brimstone, because they just were unlucky? Yeah. The more you think about it, the more it doesn't make sense. So I'm going to wind this one up. Hope you do some like and comment, getting some lively discussion on this stuff here. Try to keep it clean and friendly for all. And, you can subscribe. Mormon Truth videos and the Dodger Game channel too. Not all of it's the same, but I'm trying to put this series on both. In the name of the Age of Reason, amen.